Hi, everyone. It's so nice to see so many familiar names and also new names in the chat. I'm Lucy. I'm the lead B Corp and Impact Consultant at Greenheart. Before we dive in, I'd just like to say a very brief word about who we are and why we're here today. So we're Greenheart. We're a full-service social and environmental impact consultancy, and we are ourselves a certified B Corp since 2017. We help clients across a wide range of industry with sustainability and helping them move beyond sustainability as usual to be truly fit for the future. We do this with a wide range of services, from setting sustainability strategy, materiality assessments, to managing environmental impact, setting robust net zero strategies, all the way down to reporting and disclosures. Arguably, one of the service line that we might be most known for is our B Corp advisory services, helping companies essentially at any stage of their own B Corp journey. So today you'll be hearing a little bit from myself, but I'll be tag teaming with my colleague Daisy Levington on the presentation, and Molly, who you just heard speak, will be moderating the chat and the Q&A. Obviously, we're also supported by our awesome Greenheart team. You might see a few of their names as well pop in the chat in various moments through this webinar. So whether you're yourself a B Corp Pro or a B Corp newbie or a B Corp curious at this stage, if you are here, it means that you know one thing, is that last month was a pretty major milestone in the B Corp movement with the launch of the new standards. This is why we're here. In this session, we hope to give you a little bit of insights as to what the new standards entail, and most importantly, help to prepare. So in terms of agenda, we'll start with giving you an overview of the new B Corp standards and what they include. We have also picked a few topics where we expect companies to potentially have some challenges or at least a bit of work to do, and wanted to share some reflections and our thoughts on how to approach these topics. We'll also share a few final reflections on helping you to embrace these new standards with confidence. And hopefully, if we do everything in time, we will also have generous time for Q&A at the end. So to get us started, I'll hand over to Daisy.
Thank you, Lucy. So we're going to dive into a brief overview about how the structure of B Corp is changing. So the new standards are changing structure significantly. And the first key change that we're seeing is that there's a new element called the foundation requirements. So this will be upfront at the beginning of your journey to become a B Corp. And the foundation requirements have three main elements. The eligibility will be checked here. The legal requirement will be checked here, and also the risk profile. So if you're familiar with the previous version of B Corp, then you'll know that these elements were previously scattered throughout the journey, and you maybe would find a hiccup later on down the line in terms of eligibility or risk or controversial industries. But now we're really pleased to see that this is right up front at the start of the journey, and that means that any elements that you need to look into more in terms of eligibility or risk will be dealt with at the beginning through the foundation requirements, which is really fundamental part of becoming a B Corp. And then we move on to looking at the performance requirements. So these are going to be made up of 7 impact topics, where previously we were looking at 5 impact areas in the B impact assessment. And we'll go into a bit more detail about what each of those 7 impact topics listed entail a little bit later. And the key change here is that we're moving from a system where previously you had to score 80 points across the 5 impact areas to now moving towards mandatory requirements across the 7 impact topics, and there will be no scoring at all. So the whole aim is to meet the mandatory requirements, which will be specified through specific compliance criteria. So those compliance criteria will then be verified to state whether you're meeting the requirement or if you still have some work to do. So that's how the broad structure is changing. In terms of tailoring by company size and sector, there's still 3 ways that the new B impact assessment will be tailored towards your company's context. And this is similar to how we've seen the B impact assessment tailored previously. So firstly, tailoring by company size. So some of these size categories might look familiar, but there's a key change that we need to pay attention to. So the number of workers measured in full-time equivalent, which is different to headcount, so make sure you check that calculation, and also considering the revenue in US dollars. So, for example, a medium-sized company with 50 to 249 employees, they may have a revenue within 10 million to 75 million, and that means they'll be in the medium category, which is great. But if they happen to have a revenue that's actually higher than 75 million, so for example, you have 100 employees, so you're in the medium line on the FTE column, but actually your revenue is also 100 million, that means you would be bumped up to the large category. So it's really important to pay attention to both that FTE, the full-time equivalent figure, and the revenue when checking your size category against the new standards. The second way is the equity mechanism. So this is how B-Lab are now taking into consideration where your company is based and therefore what standards you're going to need to meet. And there's a very in-depth methodology, which we can share the link to. B-Lab have been very transparent about how they've calculated which countries fit into which of these three categories. They've determined which countries face fewer operational barriers, some operational barriers, and more operational barriers. And depending on which country you're based in, so here in the UK, we are not deemed to have as many operational barriers. So there's a 0% opt-out of the sub-requirements. Whereas in other countries, such as China or Mexico, they have some operational barriers as deemed by B-Lab's ranking. And therefore, they can then opt out of 10% of the sub-requirements that would usually be applicable to that business. The third way that the new standards are tailored to the company's context is tailoring to the company sector. And this is similar to how we saw the B impact assessment previously tailored to a company. So this will be selected firstly when you sign up to the B impact assessment or when you're signing up to the new standards self-assessment tool. You will select which industry you're in based on services, manufacturing, retail, or wholesale, and then give a little bit more information into specifically which industry you're a part of, and therefore that will determine the outcome of which standards appear in your B impact assessment. So this is a similar function to how we previously saw it in the B impact assessment. So I'll pass over to Lucy to dive a little bit deeper into the 7 impact topics.
Yes, so we've been talking about requirements, but what do they actually look like? So the performance requirements in a new standard are structured around 7 impact topics. In case you were a little bit familiar with the draft previously, you will notice that there are no complementary impact topics anymore. Also that the fair wages and workplace culture themes were merged into fair work. But if you didn't follow what I just say, because you were not familiar with the draft, it doesn't matter. What matters is really what you have in front of you now, which are the 7 impact topics in the performance requirements of the new standards. The way these are structured is under each impact topic, there are a number of requirements. All of these requirements includes a number of sub-requirements, which each has their own compliance criteria, which means a bit of information about what exactly the company needs to have in place, what evidence they need to be able to provide to really evidence that the practice is in place and that they meet the sub-requirement. So the structure, the overall structure of the requirements is similar and consistent for companies across sizes and industries. What matters and what changes, depending on the tailoring mechanism that Daisy has just explained, is which specific sub-requirement will apply to your business. And obviously with that, what is the depth of work and of evidence that they include. So we won't have time to go and deep dive into every single of those impact topics because that could easily be a 1-hour webinar for all of those. However, we thought we could give you a little bit of a taste of all of the topics that are covered. So I'll try and do my best at skim through these a little bit. So first, purpose and stakeholder governance is really about embedding purpose in the way the business operates, having a public purpose statement, but also embedding stakeholder governance in the way the business is managed. So identifying your stakeholders, conducting a materiality assessment, but also having feedback mechanisms and engagement mechanism with your stakeholders, not to bleed through grievances, as well making sure that you have transparent communication, that these are ethical and responsible, and that the company communicates progress against the strategies that they have set. All of this shall also be overseen by the company's highest governing body. Secondly, fair work. This is really the topic that sets expectations for all of your worker-related practices. So first, just having clear expectations from your workers, good contracts and expectation on working hours, but also looking at fair wages, so which can be achieved either through living wage or other equivalent mechanisms. But also everything around worker engagement, worker representation, taking worker feedback into account in decision that will affect them, as well as having plans for monitoring and improving your workplace culture, which includes, but is not limited to, employee engagement, satisfaction, and psychological safety, for instance. Third, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, JEDI. And we will talk a little bit more about this topic later on, so I'll be quite short here, but it's essentially looking on the one hand at monitoring data so that you can assess for potential disparities in worker-related measurements depending on employees' social identity. And the second part is basically the requirement to have an action plan and do things, have a plan in place to improve and continuously improve your inclusive culture. And the way this plan looks can be done and can be achieved by fulfilling a number of sub-requirements that are actually optional. So you can really tailor your plan to what fits best your context and your aspirations. First topic is human rights. Human rights is a new topic. We will also be talking a bit more about it later. The minimum expectation for all companies is to have a commitment to human rights and potentially a public human rights policy, and also to assess where your main human rights impact might be across your value chain and on operations, and then obviously setting strategies so that you can mitigate and improve on your human rights impact, and as well as collaborate with your suppliers to mitigate human rights impact across the value chain. Fifth topic, climate action is material for all companies. This is yet another one that we'll talk a bit more about later on, but is essentially looking at monitoring greenhouse gas emissions, setting targets, and having either an action plan or a transition plan depending on the size of your business. Where am I? Sixth topic, environmental stewardship and circularity, is essentially looking at all things environmental impact and really making sure that the company is taking action on those environmental impacts that are the most material to the business. So where you have the most impact will be a little bit dependent, obviously, depending on the type of business that you are. So this impact topic is making sure that you are assessing what your environmental impacts are, that you have a strategy then to remediate or mitigate some of those impacts, taking into account circular economy principles and circular design principles, especially if you're designing products, and then have an action plan, a strategy to really implement and make progress on your environmental goals, as well as engage with your suppliers to achieve those environmental goals. Last but not least, government affairs and collective action is looking at ways that companies should have responsible practices when it comes to, for instance, lobbying and tax policy. And last but not least, collective action are all the ways that a business could engage with their peers or with industry groups or with their community to achieve higher social and environmental impact. So this is a little bit of a summary. Back to you, Daisy, and I'll take a sip.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for that fantastic overview. That's a hard thing to achieve in a short amount of time, but as you can see, there's so much content in these new standards. So yeah, I'm sure each of you will be able to dive into the detail of what's required for each of your businesses after this webinar. So just to sum up some of the key changes in the new standards, just to repeat and confirm, we're moving to mandatory requirements. So all B Corps will need to meet the requirements that are required of them based on their company size and context. And something that we were previously expecting to see in these new standards were exceed criteria to show how a company can go above and beyond and be better than the minimum requirements. However, in the final version of the standards that have now been published, we can confirm there are no exceed criteria. So basically, that means that we're moving towards a B Corp community that are raising the bar together. So it's all about moving all B Corps together to meet the same mandatory requirements, of course, based on your company size and context. So it's no longer about counting score or being better than others in the community. It's about lifting us all up to meet these new standards, which are a lot more challenging. The next thing to mention is you might have questions about impact business models, because we know that many companies in the B Corp community have impact business models, which if you have one, you'll know exactly what that means. But basically, impact business models need further consultation before they can be included in the new B Corp standards. So B Lab has decided to launch the standards without them for now, as they are just with the 7 mandatory impact topics. And there's going to be further consultation and a redesign of IBMs coming hopefully later this year. And we'll be definitely engaging with that ourselves as a B Corp with an impact business model. So yeah, basically B Lab didn't want to delay the timeline any further, bearing in mind this extra consultation that's needed. The next thing, which I saw, Ajita, you asked in the chat, in the Q&A function, how do we show we're continuously improving if there's no score, which is a really, really good question. And just to confirm, continuous improvement is now built into the requirements. So there are new requirements that will come into play at year 3 after your first certification and year 5 after your first certification against the new standards. So if you look into the detailed PDF versions of the new standards that are available to download from B Lab's website, you can see details of this, and there'll be a couple of examples later on as well. And then the final thing that's a very big change is that B Corp will now be verified by a third party, not by B Lab analysts directly. So this is a change for B Lab to move towards meeting certification best practice, so more moving towards a model that other certification bodies are using, and also will allow them to meet a new upcoming EU directive, which we'll touch on in the next slide as well. So the timeline for the rollout. You're telling us all of this information, but when is it happening? Very good question. So for aspiring B Corps who are certifying as a B Corp for the first time, there is still time to certify under the current B Corp standards. So that's the current system with 5 impact areas and 80 points. So if you're in a strong position where you feel like you're already meeting the current version of the standards, maybe you have a score of 80, 85, 90 already on the B impact assessment. If you're a small, medium business, you can submit up to the end of 2025. The key thing to check is large and multinational aspiring B Corps will have to certify under the new standards. And the key threshold to check if that applies to you is if you have a revenue of over £100 million or more than 250 employees, then you might fall between the medium or the large category. So you need to get in touch with B Lab to confirm if you're allowed to certify under the under the current standards, or if you'll have to wait till the new standards. And then for aspiring B Corps who want to certify on the new standards, we're expecting submissions to begin from 2026 onwards. B Lab have not specified an exact date in 2026 when they'll be accepting submissions yet, but we're hoping to get more details of that later this year. So for already certified B Corps who are looking to recertify in the next couple of years, this is the timeline for you. And there's a lot of information trying to be conveyed here, so I'll try and talk through it one by one. So I am going to go through it by your recertification date, which you will be able to view on the B Impact dashboard. So if your recertification date is in 2025, so you're expecting to have to recertify this year, then you need to submit your version 6, so the current B Corp standards, the 5 impact topics, 80 points, by 30th of June, so before the end of Q2. And in the UK, only companies with a reset due date in 2025 can still recertify before this 30th of June date. However, it's worth noting if you're based outside of the UK, then this might vary, as with some other B Lab global partners, there are different rules about when companies can recertify. So just double check that if you're outside of the UK. If your recertification due date is in 2026, which is us at Greenheart, so we'll fall into this category, you will be recertifying under the new standards with a 12-month extension. So you can see kind of the long dotted line box there. So that means you will be submitting at some point during late 2026 or early 2027 is what we're expecting. And then B Corps with a recertification due date in 2027, you're very prepared if you're watching this webinar, and you've got plenty of time to prepare to recertify under the new standards. So there's plenty of time to embed all of those new practices. And that's really B Lab's aim with this gradual transition to the new standards, is to make sure that all B Corps have adequate time to be able to meet these new requirements, because they know that they're a lot more challenging than the previous version. The last thing to mention on this slide is if you have operations in the EU that are engaging business to consumer transactions, so whether you're selling products or services directly to a consumer, you will need to recertify early, so before September 2026, which is when this new EU directive is coming in, if you want to continue using B Corp as like an externally facing sustainability label, so for example, on your website or on your product packaging. And this is because the B Corp framework will only be compliant under that new EU directive, under the new standards. And there's lots of complexities about why that is. So you need to get in touch with B Lab if you think that might affect you, and they will prioritize your submission and review against the new standards to make sure that all B Corps can comply with this new EU directive and make sure that they can continue using their B Corp logo in an externally facing way. So that's the timeline of the rollout, and we're happy to answer more questions about that later on in the Q&A section, because we know it is very confusing. So yeah, we're here to support you with that. So now we're just going to give a little sneak peek into the B Impact platform, which is an upgraded version of the current B Impact assessment. And if you haven't logged onto it yet, then you'll be able to kind of know how to navigate it after these next couple of slides. So first of all, the B Impact platform now houses the current B Corp standards, so the old version, and it also houses the new standards as well. So you'll be able to see against that measure section on the menu, that's where the old standards are housed under the original B Impact assessment. And you can see the SDG Action Manager, which some of you might be using there as well. And then there's a new section with that nice lightning bolt, which is where you access the new standards if you want to have a look at which requirements are relevant to you. It's worth noting that for the new standards self-assessment, only the year 0 requirements are currently showing up in the B Impact platform. They haven't built in the functionality for the year 3 and year 5 standards to be visible in the platform just yet. So if you want to look at those, you need to look at the big PDF downloads, or get in touch with us, because we might be able to help you understand what they are as well. So how do I actually see the requirements? So when you've gone onto the B Impact platform, you've clicked on that new standards section by the lightning bolt, then you'll be able to dig into what requirements are actually relevant to you. So for example, here you can see the human rights HR1, and then the sub requirement is listed below, which is 1.1. So for this company, this is the sub requirement that is relevant to their business. For number 3 below, human rights 3, the HR 3.4 is one of the sub-requirements that's relevant to this company under this requirement. So don't panic if you can't see like 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, because those sub-requirements are not relevant to you. They might be relevant to a smaller or a bigger company. And finally, digging in one layer deeper, the sub-requirement lists underneath the compliance criteria. So this details exactly how you meet that sub-requirement. And one thing to note, if you're part of a corporate group, is that each sub-requirement also has details of how you should take that action forward if it's an action relevant to the corporate group, and how you should display how you've implemented that at your level of the subsidiary, for example. So that compliance criteria section is super useful and is a really fantastic development that we didn't have in the previous version of the B Impact assessment. So now we'll move on to discussing the key challenges and how to approach them.
Thank you, Daisy. So indeed, we expect that companies potentially will have a number of challenges, but we have at least picked 5 different topics. Can go to the next slide. 5 different topics that we will quickly chat through today. So first one is materiality and stakeholder engagement. If you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. So stakeholder governance is and has always been really a cornerstone of B Corp, and stakeholder governance is essentially making sure that all B Corps take into account the interest of all of their stakeholders, not only their shareholders, in their decision making. So far, this was really embedded in the mission log. That is a commitment that all companies make to stakeholder governance. Stakeholder governance is really getting into action in the purpose and stakeholder governance impact topic of the new standards, and this links to materiality. So just in case you're not too familiar with what materiality is, materiality assessment is essentially a process whereby a company assesses which topics, environmental, social, governance topics, are material, meaning important to the business. These can be important from one of 2 perspectives, either because the company has an impact on its stakeholders and the world around them, and this perspective inside out is called impact materiality, or it can be because those topics have an influence on the business, on its risks, opportunities, and financial prospects. So this outside-in perspective is called financial materiality. Double materiality, sometimes abbreviated as DMA, essentially just means an assessment that looks at both of these perspectives at the same time. Why this is important, why materiality is important for B Corp. So the purpose and stakeholder governance topic introduces a requirement for companies that are large and above to conduct an impact materiality assessment. This is essentially making sure that companies have a strategy that really prioritizes the topics on which they have the most impact on stakeholders and the world. It's worth noting that even if you don't have a requirement to conduct an impact materiality assessment, you might still be required to assess some of your impacts. So for instance, companies that are medium-sized and above need to, 1, identify their salient human rights issues, meaning what topics, human rights topics they might have the most impact on, or might have existing issues in their operation and supply chain. And likewise, should also assess their most material environmental impacts, actual or potential, positive or negative in their operations and value chain. Also, to understand impact materiality and what impacts an organization has on its stakeholders in the world, it's important to engage with those stakeholders and get their perspective on the ways, positive and negative, that you impact them. And stakeholder engagement is really woven into many different areas of the new B Corp standards, be it through worker representation and feedback mechanisms to supplier engagement, for instance. So in summary, what this all means is that conducting an impact materiality, conducting a materiality assessment will be valuable for your company and for your B Corp journey, whether it is a requirement or not. Because, for instance, assessing your environmental impacts or human rights impact can be done as standalone assessments, but it could also be conducted through a robust materiality assessment. Also, our take on this is that while B Corp only requires to conduct an impact materiality assessment, we would strongly recommend that you consider a double materiality assessment, not only because it is generally best practice, but also for two things. One, in case you have, say, either voluntary or mandatory reporting requirements that require you to address financial materiality, you might as well address both at the same time and gain efficiency through this process. But most importantly, conducting a double materiality assessment really bridges and creates a link between the areas in which you have a high impact and also the risks and opportunities that might result for the business as well. So it is really ensuring that you have a holistic perspective of your impacts, risks, and opportunities that might emerge on the midterm, longer term, and make your business essentially more resilient. So our word of advice as well is that while, a materiality assessment, and I know that a couple people in the audience have conducted one, can at times feel like a bit of an overwhelming or intense kind of exercise. It is one that is really strategic, and we really invite you to see it for the strategic exercise that it is, that will give you robust foundation for your sustainability strategy and also your B Corp journey. And therefore, it's really important that in this process, you engage with your leadership and all of your team as early on as possible, but also build an approach that makes sense to you. So it doesn't have to be a complete monster of an exercise if you're a smaller size business. You can absolutely find an approach that feels comfortable to you and that will just achieve the level of outcomes and outputs that you're looking for. But most importantly, then helps you embed a bit materiality thinking in the way you're operating the business and have a different rhythm across the years where you review how has our how has the environment changed? Does it create new risks and opportunities for us? Also, what more feedback, what more engagement have we conducted with stakeholders all along the year? And should we reassess and revisit our strategy as a result? So second topic we just touched on a little bit is human rights. So human rights is really important in the new standards. It is a new impact topic. It might not be a new topic for some of you, but it is a new topic in the new in the B Corp standards, as it didn't really feature. It wasn't really properly assessed in the BIA so far. So with the new standards, really, human rights is a topic for all B Corps of all size. At the very minimum, companies should have a public commitment or a public policy to commit to respecting human rights. But then what this actually looks like into practice will be dependent on your size and industry. So first, if you are medium and above, you will need to conduct an assessment of your salient human rights issues, which might be done by a materiality assessment or could be done as a standalone exercise. But most importantly, then once you have assessed those salient human rights issues, what kind of strategy and what kind of processes you put in place will be completely dependent on what those issues are, and also depending on the kind of business that you are. So for instance, if you are a manufacturing business or wholesale retail businesses sourcing ingredients and shipping products all around the world, you might have a more stringent expectation on your supply chain due diligence. If you're an investment company, you might have expected increased due diligence requirement for your investments. And if you are a service business, you will be required to assess the potential human rights impact of the client projects that you decide to work on. So in short, human rights is important to everyone, but what this concretely looks like will be very much dependent on your size and industry, and therefore we invite you to have a deep dive, have a look in your own BIA and have a look at which requirements apply to you depending on your size and industry. Then another social topic is JEDI, so Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. It's interesting in the current climate, cough, cough, to see that JEDI is still and remains an important topic in the B Corp standards, meaning that all B Corps will be expected to have a commitment and do something to foster inclusive communities. What is also interesting to note is that this is actually the topic in which there is the greatest flexibility in the standards. So the requirements are actually structured in two parts. One, on monitoring data, but we are not looking at monitoring your diversity data. So for instance, percentage of of workers of a certain social identity, the data monitoring requirement in the new standards is focused on actually trying to assess if there might be any disparities between individuals depending on their identity. So it is looking at measuring some worker-related measurements. So these could be promotion, retention, participation in training, job categories, like all of these types of worker measurement, and to be able to draw an analysis of them based on at minimum gender or sex at birth, and depending on your size, possibly as well on another social identity. Then the second and meatiest part of the JEDI requirements are to basically have an action plan. But what this action plan really looks like is very, very flexible. So B Lab has, or the standards have listed a list of, I think, 19 different potential sub-requirements that a company might most pick and choose. So here the recommendation is really, like, be sure about what you're trying to achieve, but also what are like either the target demographics that you want to support, what are underrepresented stakeholders, what are underrepresented group in the industry that you work in and in your communities or customer base, and really craft a plan that fits that fits with your own context and with your own ambitions, and have confidence that there will be different sub-requirements, because these are looking at things inside the workplace, outside the workplace, and in the local communities, and there will be ways in which this can be recognized in the sub requirements and in the standards. So in summary, some level of data monitoring, but focus on assessing if there are disparities, but most importantly, craft a plan that is yours, yeah, for that as well, possibly have a look, have a browse in the B Corp standards on your own account if you're already certified, or on the lovely long PDFs if you are not certified yet and haven't created an assessment. And that's when Daisy, I think you're mute. Yes.
Yeah, my just trying to find the button between all of the screens. It's all good. Is the PowerPoint still? It's still there, right? Yeah, good. Sorry about that minor tech flaw there. So moving on to climate action. So last week we were really lucky to collaborate with B Lab on an impact collaboration session, which was the first of their series to upskill the community about the new standards. And our climate expert, Fern, did an amazing job of communicating lots of detail about the climate action standards. So keep an eye out for that content, because we will share it as soon as we're able to outside of the B Corp community. But today we're just going to give a really brief overview of the climate action elements, mainly focused on what the requirements are based on different sizes. There's a really kind of clear distinction between kind of micro, small and medium-sized businesses and what their requirements are versus large and above in this impact topic in particular. But in general, the focus for everyone is on action. So all B Corps need to have a public plan of how they're going to take action to meet a 1.5 degree aligned world and future economy. So for small businesses, that looks like doing a climate action plan, which is a slightly higher level plan, and it must be 1.5 degree aligned with SMART targets. So specific, measurable, actionable, and time bound. And also you have to show that your highest governing body is monitoring this plan as well. You don't necessarily need to have full emissions accounting. It's not required. However, it is encouraged, because obviously that's a really helpful basis to create an action plan from. However, for large businesses, there is a significant step up in the requirements in this impact topic. Emissions reporting is mandatory and also must be third-party verified. So for large businesses, that's a key kind of next step. Depending on which year you're planning to either certify or recertify, you need to bake that into your budgeting process for your emissions reporting to be audited usually at the same time as your financials would be audited, and which might be a key change in what you've been doing up until this point. The other key difference for large businesses is that a climate transition plan is needed, but this is not until year 3. So you actually have a little bit more time to build that plan, because B Lab recognised that it is a significantly bigger ask to have a full transition plan. And some of the key differences in terms of upgrading that action plan to a transition plan is some of the elements that are underlined in the table. So, for example, you need full stakeholder engagement on your transition plan to make sure that it's realistic and that it also includes just transition. So making sure you're engaging with stakeholders to make sure that they're taken into account and won't be negatively impacted by your climate transition plan, for example. You also need to have specific quantitative progress reports. So whereas smaller businesses can have more of a narrative sharing their progress on projects and their SMART targets, the larger businesses will need numerical evidence that they're making progress and reducing their emissions in line with a 1.5 degree world. So the broad overview and specific takeaway is the focus is on action. I guess the clue's in the name with that one, but it's really important to pay close attention to those specific requirements if you're a small versus a large business in those different categories. Finally, we'll move on to supply chain. So supply chain is not a kind of one of those 7 impact topics that we mentioned before. And instead, it's woven throughout all of the different 7 impact topics. So we foresee that this will come up as a regular question about the new standards. How do I engage my supply chain? What do I need to do in terms of speaking to my suppliers about these different 7 impact topics? So as an overview, supply chain considerations are embedded throughout the new standards. So, for example, making sure suppliers are considered as a key stakeholder group whenever you're making decisions, whenever you're considering your material impacts throughout all of those elements. Even, for example, in JEDI, there's some optional requirements to monitor the diversity of your suppliers if that's an action that you wish to take forward. However, the 2 really kind of big areas where supplier engagement will be needed, and Lucy's touched on this briefly, is in human rights and environment impact topics. So both environment stewardship and circularity, and also climate action. Especially for larger companies, these 2 impact topics require significant engagement with suppliers. Firstly, to identify the material issues. So going back to that materiality assessment, whether it's the salient human rights issues or the material environmental impacts, and how those impacts manifest in the supply chain as well as in your direct operations. So once you've identified those issues, large companies then have to prioritize suppliers by risk factors. So it might be considering multiple factors such as spend or criticality of the raw materials that they're supplying you. And then you need to set targets and show that you're making progress with those suppliers, those key high-risk suppliers across those material issues. So it is quite a significant step up in terms of requirements on stakeholder, supplier specifically, engagement in these 2 areas. And this is an area that we really see a difference as well based on company size. So, for example, on the human rights, smaller companies are expected to consider human rights in the procurement decisions, as Lucy mentioned earlier. But for larger companies, they have to develop a full supplier engagement and monitoring approach and take action with those suppliers and actually show progress. So it'll be really key to make sure you have a really good overview of your supply chain. So for example, a supply chain map where you can map out all of your suppliers and then use that to create a risk profile of those suppliers, and then develop an engagement plan of how to take all of those key supplier groups on your B Corp journey with you. So we'll just move on to a few final reflections. So we've thrown a lot of information at you today, and there is yet more information that we ourselves are waiting for from B Lab. So we don't have all of the details yet, and we just wanted to be really transparent with you about some of the things we're still asking and waiting for. And of course, as soon as we get a hint of this and these answers, we'll be sharing that with our Greenheart network as well. So a few of the questions still on our minds are: when exactly will companies be able to submit on V7 during 2026? And what are the details of the assurance model? Who will the third-party verifiers be? Will there be multiple consultancies doing the verification? And what will that process look like compared to the current review process? What will the timeline be like compared to the current review process that we've become familiar with? Another big question is about multiple markets. So we've got the details about that equity mechanism if your company's based in a certain country with operational barriers. We know about that opt-out equity mechanism, but what happens if your operations are spread across multiple markets? Previously, you were able to fill out more than one B impact assessment, but there hasn't been any details clarified yet about what those requirements will look like going forwards on the new standards for companies operating across multiple markets. Finally, a key question is about the B Impact platform and what the risk profile will look like, how they will assess that, because previously that was done through the disclosure questionnaire, which was the final section of the B Impact assessment, but that hasn't been visualized yet on the B Impact platform. So we're looking forward to seeing how that will work in practical terms.
Then final reflections, we promise. Just a few last words of advice as you embrace your transition yourself. So first thing is, more than ever, your track really matters because it informs all of the requirements that will be applicable to you, and the track might be slightly different than what it was. So don't take for granted that the track that you were on, if you're a certified B Corp, might still apply. Really check your track against the new standards, including your revenue. Second, but be thorough with your gap analysis. Actually, there are a few things to be careful about. One is that the requirements, as we mentioned, the requirements for year 3 and year 5 are currently not accessible in the platform, but only on the standards PDF that B Lab has shared. So it means that if you're doing your gap analysis but want to have a view of year 3, year 5, you need to have a look at that information as well. Also, we want to flag that if you were a little bit early and started doing a gap analysis against the draft standards, some of the requirements have changed slightly in wording, but also in codes. So essentially, it's very important that you review even a gap analysis that you would have already started. Third bit is really, we would encourage you to map all of the overlaps and have really a holistic view of your plan for your B Corp journey and the requirements that will apply to you. We've picked on a few of those today, for instance, around supply chain, but it's really important, and materiality, but it's really important that you have that holistic view so that you avoid requirements being completely siloed and seen as just like little side projects, each and all of them. A lot of them have overlap, have synergies. So really have that plan clear so that you are most efficient with your journey. And last bit, B Lab has also mentioned that in the launch webinar of the new standards that they did on the 29th, so was that last week, where they really encouraged the community to provide feedback on the platform. Careful, this is not providing feedback on the new standards. The new standards are set for now and for the foreseeable future. But this is really inviting the community to share feedback about the compliance criteria and the compliance guidance. So for instance, is the criteria clear enough to understand that you know what you're expected to achieve? Are more resources helpful? So we would, as always, really encourage you all to generously share your feedback with B Lab so that they can provide even more information to us all on how to meet those requirements in the new standards. This was a lot of information, hopefully not too overwhelming. We are absolutely super excited about the new standards at Greenheart for several reasons. You got to hear a lot from Daisy and myself, but we actually asked also other members of our team about what are the things that made them the most excited about new standards. And there's definitely a lot, from recognizing circular economy to focusing on material topics to making basically your impact journey much more strategic and making it much clearer to stakeholders and the world about what it means to be a B Corp. So yeah, a lot to be excited about. But now we will actually finally move to the Q&A session. Obviously, if you need any help on your own B Corp journey and transition to the new standards, feel free to get in touch. If you're covered and don't really need help, but found this session helpful, well, please feel free to thank us with a follow on LinkedIn or sign up to our newsletter and spread the love. Right. Molly, over to you.
Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, the links for our newsletter and LinkedIn are quite recently in the chat, so hopefully you can all find them. Lots of questions. We've actually managed to answer a lot of them kind of during the session. Fern, our lovely climate expert, has been helping a lot with the climate action related ones too. So thank you so much for that, Fern. There's a couple of questions about the third-party assurance. Lindsay's asked how will auditors maintain consistency across certification or recertification compared to B Lab analysts? Will it be more consistent?
I'm happy to take that one. So this is a key change that we see certifying against the new standards. And really the whole purpose is that it will make it more consistent because the third-party auditors will be marking B Corps against that compliance criteria. So it will be a lot clearer to know whether you're going to be meeting a requirement or falling short of the requirement. Whereas previously, B Lab made decisions on which points to award based on past precedents and whether they'd awarded something to another business or not. So it's going to make it a lot clearer and a lot more consistent between businesses. And this is also part of moving towards the best practice in the industry and making sure that it is able to be marked by someone from a third party without having internal knowledge of B Lab precedents, for example.
And just to follow on from that as well, Sabrina's asked at what point does the third-party assurance come in to the assessment? So is that for quality control or kind of co-delivery of the assessment?
So that will be during the review process. So whereas currently we see in the verification stage of the review process, it's a B Lab analyst, we understand that it will be marked by a third-party assurance company or analyst. The details of that review process haven't been released yet, but we expect there'll be some kind of back and forth with that third party between the company, but we'll share information on that when we have more.
Thanks, Daisy. I'm just having a look through. There's a lot of quite detailed questions about climate action, some of which Fern has got back to us on. Louisa's asked a question about galvanizing some support for B Corps with the new EU directive. Louisa, I think we'd be very happy to chat about how we could best do that and support kind of clients and B Corps with that. I think it's quite a live situation with B Lab at the moment. So do get in touch with us and we can chat more through that. Any other questions? Please do also feel free to keep submitting questions. If we don't get to them, we can come back to you later via email as well. Lots of questions about transition plans. Smitha has asked about, she said their supplier's nature certification wasn't previously recognised by B Lab. Will that change with a third-party assessment instead of the B Lab analysts?
We would have to check the compliance criteria if that was kind of specified in the compliance criteria, whether that was accepted or not. Previously, B Lab had a list of kind of acceptable certifications that they would award points, but I would expect that would have to be a transparent resource now in order for a third party to be able to give assurance on whether a certain additional requirement was being met by a third party certification.
Yeah, I think it's quite a hard one to answer for certain now. Joe has just asked in the chat as well, I wonder if you could just repeat what you said earlier, Lucy, about clarifying what B Lab's position is in terms of early resubmissions for companies with products for public consumption, which I'm assuming is asking about the EU directive.
Yes. So indeed, this is if you are selling products or engaging into consumer transaction in the EU. And what is important is just to understand that the implication of the EU Empowering Consumer Directive is on using certification for sustainability claims. So the implication is that you would only be compliant with the directive if you have certifications that meet a number of criteria that are set in the directive. One of these criteria is to be audited by a third party, but also to have transparent public criteria. And the B Corp standards, the new B Corp standards, will be compliant with the requirements of the directive. And which means that for being compliant with the directive, companies would have to be recertified before the directive enters into force in September 2026. What we're not entirely clear about is then does that mean, like B Lab has communicated that they will accept recertification or certification on the new standards from mid-2026. So that would be what, July? But that seems like a very short time as well to certify potentially a high number of companies between July between July 26 and September 26 when the directive comes into force. So it's a question that we're wondering is if B Lab would accept earlier recertification or what is actually their plan. We know that it's kind of like an important topic. We've also heard that B Lab is doing their best, but potentially not communicating enough or as much as some companies would like. So we're really happy to try and help you navigate this issues if you have more specific information about what you're selling and what makes you think you will fall under the directive. But at the minimum, we would encourage any company that is not in touch with B Lab yet and think they might fall under the regulation to get in touch so that B Lab has you on the radar.
There's been quite a lot of questions as well in the Q&A about the new EU directive, so I think it's something that's definitely affecting a lot of companies, and we will be sure to keep you updated with any kind of information that we receive. Tati has answered this question in the chat, but it's been one that's come up a lot, so I think it would just be worth going over together. Just asking about recertification dates in 2026. Can you just reconfirm the timeline in terms of when they will be recertifying?
Shall I go for it? So if your recertification due date is 2026, then you would be granted automatically, as far as we understand for now, a 12-month extension. Also, until quite recently, there was a delay, or B Lab advised to submit your B impact assessment for recertification 6 months before. The latest communication is that this might change and that might be different. So essentially now, any company that would have a recertification due date is 2026 would have their recertification due date moved to 2027. If your recertification due date is anyways in 2027, you would be expected to certify on new standards in line with your normal recertification timeline. I think I've seen this pop into the chat as well. It's worth mentioning as well that all companies will be considered year zero. So even if you are already a certified B Corp, you will need to meet at your first certification the year zero requirement, because it will be your first certification on the new standards. And then we'll have like year 3 and year 5 requirements. You won't be expected, even if you're a B Corp for 10 years, you won't be expected to meet year 5 requirements immediately.
I think that's all the questions we have time for. If anyone has any more detailed questions, do drop us an email or a message anywhere. And yes, I'll hand over to Lucy just to say goodbye.
Yes, so goodbye. Thank you so much, you all, for your engagement, for all of the questions. We hope we covered quite a lot, but if not, please do get in touch. And yes, follow us as well on LinkedIn, sign up to the newsletters, get in touch, but most importantly, deep dive into the new standards. Hopefully you'll get as excited as we are. And obviously, if you need help, you know where to find us. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.